parts. The one is prepared, and which makes me feel secure, and the other one is more improvising, full of anxiety.
Life enhancing.
Life enhancing anxiety, exactly. I was thinking what a real privilege it is to be in this position, and right now being called to introduce you, Dr. Kirk. It's really touching and one very important moment for all of us and for me personally. I had the privilege of knowing you some years ago when we came to teach us existential psychotherapy in Gignestai, and we all had a first-hand experience of who you are and what presence means. We know the theoretical concept of presence, but we felt it to the bone. You are the embodiment of presence, and this goes beyond any description, and any other way of describing it would be at a loss of words, unless you meet Dr. Kirk personally and have this exchange of a dialogue with him. So let me now move to the more formal part of my introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Kirk Schneider to this grand stage as our keynote speaker for this major conference. Dr. Schneider is a pioneer in the field of existential psychotherapy, and his impact on the field is nothing short of remarkable. With over 4 decades of research, training, and clinical practice under his belt, Dr. Schneider has made innumerable significant contributions to the field, cementing his position as one of the most influential figures in contemporary psychotherapy, not only existential psychotherapy, but psychotherapy in general. Dr. Schneider is known for his groundbreaking work on his polarities of human existence, exploring the fundamental paradoxes and tensions that underlie the human condition. His work has emphasized the importance of embracing these polarities, rather than attempting to resolve them, as a means of promoting psychological health and well-being. Dr. Schneider has also emphasized the importance of creativity, spirituality, and community in the therapeutic process, and has developed a range of innovative approaches to psychotherapy that draw on these principles. Dr. Schneider has published over 200 articles and book chapters, and has authored or co-authored 14 books. His work has been translated into multiple languages and has had a significant impact on the field of psychotherapy. He has also been the recipient of numerous awards and honors, including the Rollo May Award from the American Psychological Association for his contributions to existential humanistic psychology. In addition to his scholarly achievements, Dr. Schneider is a licensed psychologist and has maintained a private practice for over 3 decades. He is also a fellow and former candidate for president of the American Psychological Association, and is a co-founder and current president of the Existential Humanistic Institute. Dr. Schneider's work has had a profound impact on the field, and we are honored to have him as our keynote speaker for this conference. Dr. Schneider.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alexis, for actually providing me with my biggest test of life-enhancing anxiety. One of the bigger tests, for sure, but much appreciate your introduction and deeply appreciate Gignestai's provision of this wonderful opportunity to be with you all, and really appreciate you all engaging with me here on this journey. I do think there is something to Emmy van Derzen's call for an existential movement. I think we are at that point. This is the Kairos for that, and I feel in my bones that that is beginning to gel, and it's gelling here. I think there are a few times in history when we are more needed than today. So let's do it. So I'm going to begin with a brief reading, and I think you will get a sense of the tone that I'm setting here. Both parents appeared for the first interview. They identified the patient's problem as being a thumbsucker with shreds of an old blanket, which he soaks in urine, even after his mother washed it. The patient is enuretic every night. This is an apparently withdrawn child ever since the death of his brother from myocarditis, when the patient was almost 3 years of age. Kelly, the brother, had been sick for almost 10 months and died in Boston, where he had been taken for consultation after an initial workup at Babies and Children's Hospital. The patient had been left during this time. The mother left entirely during this period in a psychological sense. She had the patient cared for during Kelly's illness by her own mother, who, according to the patient's father, was quite hysterical. The mother, according to her and her husband, was in a deep depression for about 4 years after the death of Kelly. Kelly had been a brilliant child. He talked well and was considered to be a star. He was the light of his mother's eye. Mother was and is a TV commercial spokesperson. The patient had a good relationship with his brother prior to the death and with his mother, but it was entirely secondary to Kelly. The father generally assumed the mother role with the patient. The father would take the patient, who was quite regressed at this time, to movies, Snow White, for example, plus other scary movies. The mother, following Kelly's illness, because of her rejection of the patient, was then rejected by the patient. According to my notes, the boy was very angry with his mother. This began to change somewhat when she had been in psychotherapy. This is because she was able to work more effectively with him, could talk with him, and be more of a mother. She could communicate with him, which she could not do previously because of Kelly. It is not clear why the parents have brought the patient 2.5 years old. Actually 6 years old at the time of this interview, but 2.5 when the brother died. It is not quite clear why the parents have brought the patient at this point, when he has obviously been quite disturbed for years. There is obviously much disagreement between the parents. The mother took off for a week by herself after Kelly's death, which likely made things worse, more difficult. And then several times a similar trip has been taken since. I thought, as I understood my notes, that the mother's depression, without doubt, has played a major part in the way she expresses her anger at her husband and at the patient's refusal to let her cuddle or kiss him. The patient regressed quite a bit after Kelly's death and cried for days. As I recall, my recommendation was that the patient needed psychotherapy, or perhaps even analysis, to try to work through the traumatic events in his life. in addition to the ordinary overstimulated and exciting things going on around him. As I recall, I'm not entirely sure, I think I came down on the side of psychoanalysis rather than psychotherapy, because I thought the patient likely had rather major unconscious internalized conflicts. Well, that, as you might surmise, was my own psychoanalyst describing the initial interviews with him when I was 6 years old, in 1962. And I start us off with that because I feel that's really where the book starts off. That's where anxiety starts off for me. And I thought it was very important that I really come from my own struggle with this huge concept, this central concept of existential psychology and psychotherapy. In many ways, my work in this area is an homage to my great mentor and friend Rollo May, who wrote The Meaning of Anxiety back in 1950. It was his dissertation. But for another generation at that time, and he was concerned about the over-mechanization of our culture at the time, and I think that's only been compounded at this point. So I felt it was very important to bring out the larger dimensions of this central problem for every one of us, really. And also to show that you can be in pretty bad shape with anxiety. I was terrified as a young child. Paralyzing anxiety, fears of death and dying, of germs, night terrors, witches, monsters. Of course, you can imagine my mother to some degree, my parents all implicated to some degree. I didn't have much equipment to take on this radical shift between a kind of routine and familiar life with parents, loving, very loving and good parents, and then shattered parents, moments, days later after the death, completely different world. And yet, here I am through a very long journey. But I'm going to get back to that trauma in a moment, but I want to give you a little more background about how I see anxiety playing out today. I feel very strongly that we are just flooded with anxiety today, anxiety and depression, precisely because we are not facing the deeper, more primal anxieties that could help to prevent or at least limit the degrees of anxiety that we then take on later as adults, not only individually, but collectively. And how much anxiety is transmitted among generations over time and is relatively unconscious that many of us carry, both in family systems and in cultural systems. I don't think we're very good at least in our culture, and American culture and cultures like ours, industrialized cultures, I don't think we're very good at providing the tools, the equipment, to work with our anxiety, the more invigorating, multidimensional understanding of anxiety right from the beginning of life. We're very good at techniques and technology and quick answers and quick fixes, right? But we're just not oriented toward recognizing how key addressing our anxiety from the beginning is to cultivating a more vital life, individual life, and collective life. That was a lot of the purpose for my book. I see extreme polarization, political polarization, cultural divisions, racial divisions, bigotry, prejudice, violence, wars as secondary to the problem of not having faced and really developed skills, tools to work with anxiety, which I had a great privilege to do at a very young and an impressionable age. And that was I feel that was a life-saving time with this psychoanalyst. So I define anxiety, I know it's defined in many ways, but I find a nice thumbnail definition as a terror of the unknown. That's basically what it comes down to. I mean, fear often has objects, specific objects. We're afraid of a spider, afraid of a volcano or something, but anxiety is much more cosmic in scope. It's much more about the themes that we have been addressing here so richly. I would summarize them as the groundlessness and helplessness of the human condition. Because if you don't think that we're in a groundless and helpless condition, by definition, just think about what's going on right now. We're having a conversation in a room that is anchored to a ball that is flying through the universe at 1.2 million miles an hour within a galaxy that's going 1.2 million miles per hour to a destination I don't think any of us really have a good idea of. And I don't think any of us have a really good idea of where we came from out of that cosmic mystery either. So that's where anxiety begins, from what I gather. And that certainly was core to my own anxieties. I mean, these terrors of monsters, witches, etc. Yeah, they had shapes, but ultimately it was this terrifying unknown and being like cut from the mothership and being in a free fall. And my mind coming up with all kinds of phantoms to represent this horrifying unknown, mystery, groundlessness. But, so anxiety is a signal that, you know, maybe we should mobilize in the face of the fear of the unknown. And evolutionary theorists have made a lot of this signal anxiety, you know. We don't know what that tiger is going to do, if it's going to jump out and snare us. So it obviously has an adaptive value. But that's not the only dimension of anxiety by any means. And I think we give the other dimension short shrift as well, unfortunately. And that is that anxiety is also a signal, a call to the unknown. And it's a call to wonder, discovery, possibilities. That part of anxiety lets us know we're on the edge of expanding or deepening our consciousness. And that's what I want to make a lot of hay of, or really drive home. That I think this is what the part of anxiety we need to bring more into our culture, our thinking, And it's very definitely, it comes as a full package. You're not going to get one without the other. So I think we do need to face what's been called the dark nights of the soul, if we're going to also be able to come into those edges of liberation, potential freedom, especially inner freedom, simply because to land in this earth, to be thrown, as Heidegger puts it, or Otto Rank, who I've become more and more immersed in, ejected into the world, is already a tremendous shock. And so what happens, I think Otto Rank describes beautifully what seems to happen at birth. It's this radical shift between relative non-being and unity. And I'm not just talking about the mother, and I do give very high credence to the mother here. I think that's a place where Freud was quite off base and focusing on the father. We're talking about the root of our lives, the mother. But the mother is a vehicle to the cosmos. So that radical shift from the radically unknown and mystery of the cosmos, non-being and unity, to sudden, abrupt being and pandemonium. I don't know if you've witnessed births. I have had the great honor, privilege to have witnessed my son's birth, who happens to be here, and he's rebirthing, evolving beautifully. But I was there, and what I saw was shock and terror at the beginning. And then his eyes started looking around. And there you have it, I think, the elements of terror and wonder. So that's why I don't agree with Rank's terminology of the trauma of birth. That's his classic work. I do think we need to pay more attention to Rank. And I do think he is really the fount of existential humanistic psychology. If you read his work, it's very close to Bugental and May and a number of us. In terms of the experiential, the importance of the experiential, the embodied in relating in therapy, and also this cosmic dimension, philosophical as well. But Rank, I think, reduced it too much to trauma. I'd call it the drama of birth, because I do think it includes those elements of wonder and discovery. So, I've pretty much covered what you're seeing on the screen at this point. My definition of life-enhancing anxiety, which is that invigorating anxiety that signals us that we are on the edge of wonder and discovery. And you may have seen Rollo's beautiful quote that anxiety is the flip side of freedom. Freedom, the flip side of anxiety. It certainly can be. Because what's ripped open and what's a complete void and an abyss also means all those old rules and regulations are no longer valid or viable. So there's a whole lot of freedom that's possible in there, along with the terror, if one can begin to come to terms with it. And I do think I'm describing much of the therapeutic process that we work with, especially with people who are struggling with very deep issues. I can't overemphasize the primal nature of both the terror and the call to anxiety. Again, the birth process forming the template for, I believe, basically all future anxiety and trauma. This is Rank's point. He calls it Urangst, the very beginning of anxiety. And that, I believe, is precisely why people become so defensive around anything that upsets their world around that moment where the baby, where themselves as babies, confront the unknown, confront that which is different and other. That's really what's happening there. It's a mortal confrontation at that earliest point. And so naturally, if somebody is living a very staid and routine lifestyle, and a foreigner comes in and presents something different, a lot of that stuff, that early stuff, gets stirred up. And so does the mindset, the psyche set of that time, which is no equipment to deal with it, no skills, especially if they have not been given skills. And that's another point I want to make, that how the baby is met by the caretakers and the culture is all important here. Are they met with a supportive understanding, even reveling in their unique life, their being, with supportive boundaries rather than demeaning or dehumanizing boundaries? Or are they met with fear and terror, perhaps carried over generation after generation, where they've already identified objects, places, and people that are marked by those terrible differences? Because they never had the equipment either. Nobody ever really made that a priority for them to learn that differences, that otherness could be places for discovery and wonder and possibility as well as discomfort, obviously. So here's where folks like Winnicott and Kohut, psychoanalysts, I do think play an important role existentially for us. Winnicott with his idea of the holding environment. How is a baby held? And this could happen before birth, I believe, too. It's the whole issue of difference. It depends when they're jarred out of their routine and familiarity, which can happen intrauterally, but mainly at birth, let's say. So Winnicott with the holding environment and Kohut with the transmuting internalization. I know that's a huge word, but how the parents, the culture deals with the outrageous in the child, the expressions of anger or pain, crying. How is that handled? Is it handled with a degree of centeredness and understanding and self-awareness and experience? Or is it turned away from? Is it rejected? Is it not allowed to be processed to some degree? Well, that's a key moment in therapy, right? And in therapeutic ruptures. How centered is the therapist when there's that rupture? So that the client, child, and I'm not equating the two completely, but so that they can learn new internalizations, new ways of relating to themselves that allow them to feel more whole, to feel more okayness about who they are. Less of the crushing guilt and criticism and reduction to something that's more in the parent's mind than in the child. So clearly presence is a key aspect of this. I won't belabor it. I mean, I think you all have a sense of presence. Nobody knows how to define it. I grant that right away. But my thumbnail definition is the holding and illuminating of that which is palpably significant within the person and between the person and the world, or the person and the other. So it has a holding, a kind of, I mean, Eric has brought this up, a sanctuary, a safety function that's extremely important. in letting anyone be able to evolve and grow. And through that holding, more of a natural ability to then illuminate, to explore. What's here? What's here for me? What is this about? What is life about? What deeply matters about our lives? I feel I came into those questions very early. Not right away. It took quite a bit of time, but I did come into them. And as you see here, again, without belaboring it, a lot of the research I'm drawing from is certainly Otto Rank, terror management theory. For those of you who are not aware of terror management theory, it's an emergent social psychology theory that talks about the power of death anxiety, what I would call groundlessness and helplessness, that primal point, and the impact of that on individuals and especially cultures. And they've shown when people are primed with death anxiety, they tend to become much more narrow in their perception. This is what I call the polarized mind, the fixation on a single point of view to the utter exclusion of competing points of view. That's what a fear-based consciousness promotes. Because how can you take another point of view? That means you've got to open up to the groundlessness and the helplessness. And that's the last thing you want to do if you've been taught from day one that that's mortal danger. And sometimes it is. I don't want to dismiss that. But often enough, especially in our modern era, it's not. Because we're not all barbarians, so to speak. There are barbaric people and leaders, but maybe some people are past the point of no return. I still am hoping that the critical mass of us are accessible, more accessible to each other and to meeting each other in these more holistic ways. Attachment theory, I think, is very important, but very important to this whole thesis. But I think as existential folks, we really can bring a fuller, deeper dimension here. And that is the cosmic context to those attachment issues, security, insecurity. This is why I love R.D. Laing's notion of ontological security and insecurity, because it's not just the security and insecurity before the caretakers. It's our security and insecurity before being, before all of existence. And the struggle for a home in our own being, so to speak, not only in our physical home or with our physical parents, and not to downplay that aspect and what Bowlby has so powerfully brought out. But, you take it all the way, and when you see patients who are really decompensating or in the depths of their wounds, you can't wrap categories around it anymore. I'm not going to talk about, oh, my mother did this or my father did this. No, it's a bottomless pit. I'm in a black hole. I'm in a free fall. I'm drowning. There's nothing here for me. I'm completely lost. These are existential themes, and the best we can do is to allude to them at that point. And I think we do a disservice if we try to interpret them or reduce them to something even interpersonal too quickly, or not allowing the metaphors to unfold in a more embodied way. So this is where we also can associate some of the very common understandings about the things that scare us most: rejection, abandonment, and lostness, right? The feeling of being lost. Maybe those concepts relate to you a little more directly than groundlessness and helplessness, although I find that very embodied Yeah, I think they even did a survey once where they looked at what is the thing that people fear most. I think cognitive behaviorists did this, and they found it was rejection. So the question is, how deep are you going to get into the rejection question? Are you going to take it to moment one? As soon as that parent meets the child, I think you got to take it back there. And I think trauma takes us back there, and perhaps even before the parent meets the child, even if they're supportive, because it is so jarring that it takes us into that extremely primal place of shock. And they've done studies on this too, to just give you more of a sense of the support, the physiological support for Ronk's thesis about trauma of birth. In the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, apparently a very prestigious place, they've done studies of neonates right out of the womb, and they've looked at the catecholamine levels, the levels of stress in those babies. They are higher than adult normal stress and severe adult stress. So just take that in a moment of how powerful that moment, that cleavage, and that crucible is in our lives. The still face experiment, very important. I fear that I'm running low on time, but still face experiment by Tronick and colleagues, very important in this realm as well, because what he showed basically was how quickly babies decompensate when they are not met by the parent. Often the mothers in these experiments, in the controlled condition, the mothers are responsive, they're mirroring their child, they're relating, they're reveling in the delight of this gift. And then Tronick requests that these mothers go dead-faced, poker-faced, indifferent. And how quickly those babies decompensate. They get agitated quickly, they turn away within seconds, minutes. And they start to exhibit signs of what looks like the floundering and helplessness of birth, perhaps, before being met. They have, now typically the studies have been done with 1-year-olds, toddlers, etc. But I read where they actually have done this as early as 2 hours after birth, and with the same basic results. So I think the old notions that the baby has an undifferentiated perception of the world at the beginning is a little off base. I think they have a sharper perception of what's going on, self and other, than we often realize. So this brings me to the power of life-enhancing anxiety to help us to come to a state of that I call awe, the sense of awe of living. I don't know if I even gave you the definition of my definition of life-enhancing anxiety, but it is that level of anxiety that enables us to live with and make the best of the depth and mystery of existence. So now you see maybe how it relates to that primal place. To live with and make the best of the depth and mystery of existence. To live with and make the best of the contrasts and contradictions that we immediately come into when we're born. If only as, struggling creatures at the same time as being creators and transcenders. But how do we deal with that crazy condition? So the sense of awe really is an outgrowth of developing that capacity for life-enhancing anxiety, which I believe is cultivated through a substantive presence on the part of caretakers, whether that's analysts, therapists, meditators perhaps, certain cultural contexts, but that help a person to coexist with, not get rid of that original pain or wounding. I'm not sure that's a great idea, because it seems to me that is part and parcel of a full and vital life. And those so-called negative feelings are very paradoxical. I sure learned that. I mean, anger means standing up. It can. It can also be very crippling. Sadness can mean having empathy for someone else, or having sensitivity about the world and life, as well as being extremely disabled.
I hate to interrupt you. The reminder you asked me.
10 minutes. Okay. Okay, so the idea of being able to coexist with, but not just coexist with these very difficult parts of ourselves, but to actually thrive if we can come into that edge of wonder and discovery and see more of the dimensions of both our own struggle and others' struggles, more of our humanity, really. And I like Jim Bugenthal is fond of talking about the more, coming into the more of ourselves. We are this and he'd often say and, yes, and people would often get to an and that relates to a much deeper meaning in life, what really matters in life. But even beyond meaning, I would argue that awe can go beyond meaning in its usual sense of coherence and a category or a goal. And we get this job, we get this relationship, create this project. But it's a whole new way of experiencing life, a whole new attitude of the humility and wonder or sense of adventure toward living. That's what life-enhancing anxiety can help us to move to. And if we can come from that place, we are usually experiencing a great deal of inner freedom. And I think that's probably the greatest gift of depth and experiential therapies, is that they help a person to feel an at-homeness within the uncanniness. Or I call it finding ground within groundlessness. And if we can keep, developing and expanding that ground within groundlessness, we live a fuller and more energizing life. And we're energized by the mysterious aspects and the anxious aspects, as well as the exuberant and joyful, light aspects. Well, I don't have time to go through all these people, unfortunately, right now, but these are some folks that, to me, have set the bar for finding life-enhancing anxiety in the most depraved or painful circumstances. I start with Ernest Becker because he's one of my favorite psychologists. He's actually a cultural anthropologist, but I think he wrote one of the greatest books in psychology, which is The Denial of Death, which is very much about where I'm coming from here. He talks about death anxiety as impacting so much in our world, from the extremism we see and defensiveness, both at individual and collective levels, to avoid this death anxiety. But he sees it as a complex symbol. And that's why I don't see it as just finality per se. It's more of that cosmic sense of helplessness and groundlessness. Because I don't think we really know what it is. But it's certainly enigmatic as hell, and it scares the living daylights out of most of us. But ironically, after all that study of death, Becker was dying of cancer at 49. And Sam Keane of Psychology Today comes to interview him. And he's a very tuned-in guy, too. And he said, look, after all, you've studied and thought about death as much or more than anyone in our culture. And now, in effect, you're doing your empirical experience, or your empirical study. And then Becker says something about it. It only hurts when I laugh, and he laughed a little. But he said, what can you share with us at 49 of dying of cancer? Becker proceeds to say that, well, I take solace in giving myself over when there's nothing left, meaning to me that he has lived a full and engaged life. Giving myself over when there's nothing left to the tremendous creative energies of the cosmos to be used for purposes we don't know. And even if we feel misused in some way by those purposes, that's the thing that consoles. Talk about a sense of awe, a sense of going in and out with that humility and wonder and adventure. I don't know, I just see that as, I guess, aspirational for maybe my own death or others to go that way. Zorba, I will have to underscore, and I will be meeting him through his museum, his author's museum in Crete, Kazantzakis. But the dance, Zorba's dance, in my view, was not just a lighthearted cherries and cream sort of dance. It has the whole history of Greece within it. It's got sorrow, it's got blood, it's got pain. It's got his sensitivity to his dying friend, Hortense, this French woman that he's very close with, and his moral feeling about life, about the preciousness of life. He defends a widow who is accused of unfaithfulness and is stoned, actually, by the townspeople, and Zorba goes in and tries to intervene. So this is a very seasoned, substantive human being who brings all of this to the dance. And that's part of what I love about it. He comes into that life-enhancing anxiety. He converts anxiety into the wonder and discovery of life at every moment. And he teaches the Westerner who visits him very well. Viktor Frankl, of course, who sets the bar above him of finding some inner freedom, some way of stepping out of the box of the most depraved circumstances a human could suffer, a Nazi concentration camp, by using his inner freedom and taking a risk within himself to not stay in that horrifying situation, but envision his smiling wife, the radiance of her smile, and how that impacted his whole way of being. Not to over-romanticize it by any means, and certainly not everyone can do this, but I mean setting the bar for extreme depression, extreme despair, using inner freedom and wonder to get there. Maya Angelou, the African-American poet, beautiful voice, so many ways, was raped at 7 years old, and she found life-enhancing anxiety, capacity to live with and make the best of the depth and radical unknown of existence, which she was ripped open to through her local library. So her helpful witnesses were people like Langston Hughes, the Harlem Renaissance, who she could relate to and who seemed to have gone through similar kinds of sufferings and yet emerged. And that's a real important point here too, is the model that we present to our patients or to our children or whomever, our friends, Stephen Hawking, another example, incredible, living with ALS, but connecting with the cosmos, connecting with scientific inquiry. Nevertheless, he couldn't talk. He had to use a voice activation machine. What kind of courage? We talk about existential courage. What kind of courage does that take? It's incredible to me that he kept that attitude, at least what I could see of his attitude of wonder and discovery, in spite of, and maybe even in light of, his condition. And then there's these bridge building dialogues, which I've been very involved with, which are ways of bringing cultivation of presence, so necessary, I believe, to the conflict mediation area. So we've been working with liberals and conservatives with highly structured, supportive dialogues, basically to help people begin to see each other more as people rather than just labels or stereotypes, which is the almost automatic way that we see people when we come from a fear-based mentality. Again, the polarized mind. So I have a 6-phase model that I call the experiential democracy dialogue, partly drawn from Braver Angels, which is more of a group process. They do some individual as well. I was a trained moderator for them, but I did this way before them as well. I just feel that the one-on-one in particular, and maybe you notice this too, in particular, as a way of melting a lot of those, nationalistic, religious, racial boundaries that we tend to see when we look at classes of people and groups. But when you're sitting there one-to-one, usually a lot more opens up. And so I know my time is, I have like a minute. I would offer you this exercise. I don't know that we can really do it now, but it's the first phase of this model where I have partners who are on very different sides of a cultural, political, religious issue. Before they even begin to address the actual issue, to just sit with each other, close their eyes, and take a few moments to mindfully observe what comes up for them before they even talk with these people, before they even engage. What are the thoughts and especially feelings, body sensations, and images that come up for you as you think about entering into a dialogue with this person? And watch it like a river. Don't fixate on anyone. Really do a mindful flow with it. And then I invite them for a minute or two to see if they can see a human being before them, rather than their immediate, their knee-jerk reactions. See if they can clear a space to see the more dimensions of this person with their wounds, their stories, their pain etched in their face, or their, awkwardness, how they hold themselves. Whatever it is, noticing more of the dimensions in your mind's eye of this person. And then we begin talking about their backgrounds, because it's so much to do with first getting a context instead of jumping right into some kind of debate, discussion. It's not a debate. It's a humanizing dialogue where the focus is on attempting to learn about and understand the other, rather than impose your view on them or presume you have the answer and the knowledge. And again, this is not for everybody. And I don't even think it's appropriate for everybody. I think there are some people who are, again, past the point of no return. I'm talking about the critical masses, and I think we got to mobilize the critical masses of people to marginalize those folks who have much too much power right now, in my view. So these are some thoughts as we go along here. I guess do we have about 5-10 minutes maybe?
5 minutes for questions, let's say. But first of all, let's thank you for your...
Thank you.